Asian markets fell sharply after Japan announced it will remove South Korea from its white list of favored export partners, prompting a retaliatory move from South Korea. The trade rift unsettling South Korean equities, both major indices tumbling. The Kospi lost as much as 1.5% and ended the week down over 0.9%, while the Kosdaq edged down just over 1%. Japan's move is expected to hit around 900 or more South Korean goods, in particular South Korea's chip companies, which are already facing trade restrictions. Samsung Electronics fell as much as 2% before making some recovery to end down 0.5%, while SK Hynix lost even more ground, down 3% earlier to end trade just down over 2%. Japanese indices were not immune. They tracked even bigger losses. The Nikkei plunged 2.7% in day trade, while the Topix fell 2.56%. They both ended down just over 2%. Export-reliant Japanese firms such as Mazda Motor, Panasonic and TFK Corp tumbled to end the week in the red. And finally to currencies where investors rushed to safe haven assets. The yen jumped against the greenback to a 5-week high. It's now trading at around 106.83 against the greenback. The South Korean won dropped to its lowest level since January 2017 versus the dollar at 1197.6. Now, global trade tensions are at an all-time high after South Korea announced they would drop Japan from a whitelist of trusted trade partners, just hours after Japan struck South Korea from their own list. It also follows hot on the heels of Washington breaking a trade truce with China after U.S. President Donald Trump vowed to hit Beijing with another round of tariffs on Chinese goods. The two disputes have rocked global markets and ratcheted up investor fears. Washington has reportedly signaled concern over the trade rift between Japan and South Korea.
미국도 이 상황에 대해서 많은 우려를 갖고 있고 또 앞으로 어렵지만은 어떤 노력을 미국이 할 수 있는지 할 역할을 다하겠다 하는 얘기가 있었습니다. 아무튼 일축이 이러한 상황에 대해서 그 책임을 져야 하고 또 즉각적인 이런 조치들의 철회 그리고 대화를 통한 문제 해결 노력을 경주해야 된다고 생각합니다. 감사합니다.
For a closer look, we're joined by Dr. Henry Gao, Associate Professor at Singapore Management University. Thanks so much for coming in. Now, firstly, South Korea following in Japan's footsteps. How do you think Japan is likely to react?
Well, I think this might escalate because this is something that has been going on for quite a long time, concerning the mutual animosities between Japan and Korea and also the historical problems. So I would not be surprised if this further escalates.
And with both of them striking each other off their own white lists, so what does that mean for consumers?
Well, actually, that itself doesn't affect much because taking off the white list simply means that there will be more checks in the export process. So that doesn't mean that there will be additional tariffs like what the U.S. did with China. So the real effects are small, but the symbolic effects of removing each other from the trusted partners, that one will have a major political repercussions.
And do you think that is there any possibility that there's any upside to any of this?
Well, I guess some consumers might benefit because if they could not export to each other, then they will try to find other markets. Just like, the case of Huawei in Singapore, where you see if they couldn't export to the U.S., they start more aggressively to sell to other countries, including Singapore. But on the other hand, the suppliers to these two countries, the suppliers to firms like Samsung or major Japanese firms, they would be deeply affected by this because they would have to deal with the delays at the customers.
Okay, well, let's talk about U.S. and China trade then. And how far away are we from actually feeling this as consumers as they sort of impose these tariffs on each other? How soon is it going to affect global supply chains and in effect us?
Well, actually, the effect has already happened because the U.S. has been stepping up the tariffs on China since last year. And we already seeing many firms trying to move their supply chains away from China into the neighboring region, including Southeast Asia. So you see more and more firms trying to move their manufacturing bases from China to countries like Vietnam and Thailand and Indonesia and so on. So I think there will be some winners from these trade war countries which replace China as the supplier to the U.S. But on the other hand, for countries like Singapore, which relies a lot on the re-export, on the transshipment, I think there will be some negative effects on Singapore, as we have seen from the latest economic data.
Well, with both of these sort of frictions between South Korea and Japan and with US and China, how concerned should we be that international trade is really in for a long haul when it comes to shakeups?
I think from what we see in the U.S.-China confrontation, the U.S. has indicated that what they are doing to China is not just a temporary. It's going to last a long time because they really see China as their #1 competitor. So this strategic competition between the two countries will last for a long time. I would say at least 5 to 10 years. So we would have to adjust, to try to readjust the supply chains, to try to readjust how you approach American firms, Chinese firms, and we will see major reshuffling in the supply chain across the world, certainly including this region.
So now that we've seen sort of two different spats sort of grow in effect or become more sort of conflicting in nature, are we likely to see other nations or other countries become embroiled in these sorts of trade spats, or does this in effect encourage other nations to therefore try and get along better in fact and find new opportunities?
Well, I think the more pessimistic view is now prevailing. That is exactly what you see, from the Japan-Korea confrontation. So economic aggression is something like some contagious disease. You see that the U.S. has been acting very aggressively towards China, and Japan is basically following the example of the U.S. by adopting this kind of a rhetoric of national security and use it to justify economic sanctions against countries which it has political problems. So I think maybe we will see more such aggression, not just by U.S. And China, but also spreading to other countries.
And do you think that should be a concern for us here in Southeast Asia? Do you see any potential conflicts with any of our sort of neighbors?
Definitely. There's something called a broken window theory, which says that if you have one broken window in a building, then other people will follow, try to vandalize the whole building. So, if the U.S. can break WTO rules without any repercussions, then other countries would take note and they will try to do the same. They will try to use this opportunity to use trade aggression against countries that they have problems. So definitely we will see more such acts in the region by countries with historical problems.
Yeah, bumpy road ahead indeed. Thank you so much for coming in, sharing your thoughts with us. Dr. Henry Gao, Associate Professor at Singapore Management University.